Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts about The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. Now, this is an early Miss Marple mystery, and if nothing else, I'd like to solicit the comment section and find out what is your favorite Miss Marple mystery. In large part because I have not read nearly as many Miss Marple stories as I have the Hercule Poirot stories or even Christie standalone novels. I've been an avid reader, in particular the Poirot stories, for 25 years. Since I was an early adolescent, I've been enjoying Agatha Christie's mysteries. But there's something that's different about the Miss Marple stories, whether it's the tone, the locale, the point of view in them. There's something that is different, and I haven't enjoyed them nearly as much. So I wanted to return to Miss Marple and read this early one, Murder at the Vicarage. And there are elements of it that I really, really enjoyed. In particular, there's a passage towards the end where Miss Marple almost gives her origin story about why she thinks, around mysteries, why she engages with society and the world in her village in this way. There's also a fascinating aside in which a character sort of expostulates on the idea of crime and punishment, on the concept of capital punishment. And it's a very interesting and reflective topic that Christie's introducing in the novel. There are elements of it that I think work as an interesting mystery, but there are other elements that I do think fall short, and I wonder if it was because Christie was still developing the way she wanted to portray Miss Marple. In particular, sort of as a response to an adaptation of a character in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which I think is one of her out-and-out masterpieces. So let's dig in. I want to share that passage from the end where Miss Marple talks about herself, and she notes, "You see," she began at last, "living alone as I do in a rather out-of-the-way part of the world, one has to have a hobby. There is, of course, woolwork and guides and welfare and sketching, but my hobby is, and always has been, human nature. So varied and so very fascinating, and of course in a small village, with nothing to distract one has such ample opportunity for becoming what I might call proficient in one's study. One begins to class people quite definitely, just as though they were birds or flowers, group so-and-so, genus that, species that. Sometimes, of course, one makes mistakes, but less and less as time goes on, and then too, one tests oneself. One takes a little problem. For instance, the gill of picked shrimps that amused dear Griselda so much, a quite unimportant mystery, but absolutely incomprehensible, unless one solves it right. And then there was that matter of the changed cough drops and the butcher's wife's umbrella, the last absolutely meaningless, unless on the assumption that the greengrocer was not behaving at all nicely with the chemist's wife, which, of course, turned out to be the case. It is fascinating, to apply one's judgment and find that one is right. And so there we have Miss Marple's sort of Sherlock Holmes expostulation moment. And it works. It's interesting to see a character that we've spent such little time with, honestly, across the course of the novel, begin to deliver this philosophy around herself and why she is such a keen observer of the humans she interacts with. And it works. That said, I don't know that The Murder at the Vicarage fully works. We are presented primarily from the point of view of the vicar, Len, who's self-deprecating in that way that Christie can write. And he's effectively self-deprecating. It opens the story, well, yeah, I don't know where to start this, but I picked this lunch because that's the one where I said that, well, if anybody murdered Colonel Prothero, they'd be doing the world a huge favor. And of course, that's who ends up being murdered. But there's not quite the energy, the vitality to the mystery. There are characters investigating it. We have, of course, an Inspector Slack, who can't seem to, ever get on the right track of the trail and is constantly just plowing ahead as everyone else is trying to explain to him that a clock was set a different time, or that, someone else has an alibi and he's just constantly doggedly pursuing the course. So there are elements of humor that sort of develop, but they never quite coalesce in the way that Christie does in the mysteries that I've read that I really regard as masterpieces. But there is Miss Marple, the neighbor who lives, her garden sort of adjoins the garden there at the vicarage. And so there are things she observed, and she saw someone who she herself is, in a sense, the alibi for one suspect in this killing. And she's perhaps observed other things going on the past few days, observing, of course, the vicar himself, his nephew, Dennis, the vicar's wife, Griselda, who's much younger, and who seems to have had a connection with this artist, who also had a connection with the murdered man's wife. And so she notes 7 suspects. And we don't quite have the quite panache that Christie would later conjure in works like Murder on the Orient Express or even Death on the Nile, where she really there's a whole group of suspects, and she delineates each of them very carefully and very skillfully. Here, one of the suspects is a poacher named Archer, who we never really see in the entire book. And that's, I think, to the work's detriment. It's not quite as fully fleshed out. It's not quite as fully developed. I don't know that Miss Marple herself is as fully developed as, Christie had achieved with Poirot in earlier works. So, as I said, I would really be curious to know what others really do enjoy in the Miss Marple series, because I continue to find this one to be just a shade below what Christie's capable of. However, there is that fascinating section where she examines the concept of capital punishment in a mystery. And it's interesting to note at the end, I don't want to spoil it, but at the end, there is an ambiguous ending in terms of what is the punishment for the suspects who were caught at the end. And this perhaps reflects on that. She goes, character goes, because your job deals very largely with what we call right and wrong, and I'm not at all sure that there's any such thing. Suppose it's all a question of glandular secretion. Too much of one gland, too little of another, and you get your murderer, your thief, your habitual criminal. Clement, I believe the time will come when we'll be horrified to think of the long centuries in which we've indulged in what we may call moral reprobation, to think how we've punished people for disease, which they can't help, poor devils. You don't hang a man for having tuberculosis. He isn't dangerous to the community. In a sense, he is. He infects other people. Or take a man who fancies he's the emperor of China. You don't say how wicked of him. I take your point about the community. The community must be protected. Shut up these people where they can't do any harm. Even put them peacefully out of the way. Yes, I'd go as far as that. But don't call it punishment. Don't bring shame on them and their innocent families. I looked at him curiously. I've never heard you speak like that before. I don't usually air my theories abroad. Today I'm writing my hobby. You're an intelligent man, Clement, which is more than some parsons are. You won't admit, I dare say, that there's no such thing as what is technically termed sin, but you're broad-minded enough to consider the possibility of such a thing. It strikes at the root of all accepted ideas, I said. Yes, we're a narrow-minded, self-righteous lot, only too keen to judge matters we know nothing about. I honestly believe crime is a case for the doctor, not the policeman and not the parson. In the future, perhaps, there won't be any such thing. And so it introduces a very interesting element to a Christie mystery. And one that I certainly appreciated, as I said. Those were two of the gems that I think really shone in this novel. But, as I said, please let me know what your favorite Miss Marple mysteries are. As I had mentioned, there is a way in which Miss Marple's character and her genesis very much exists in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which I think is one of the 3 or 4 very best novels Christie wrote. And it's an early Hercule Poirot mystery. And I won't spoil the ending, but I'll link my my video discussion to it in the description box below, because it is absolute dynamite. It's one I highly, highly recommend. Really enjoy it during this March Mystery Madness. But the narrator of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd has an older sister who lives with him and is about the same age as Miss Marple would be. And she sort of is interested and wants to talk to Poirot about the case and discuss the different details that she's observed. And when there was a stage adaptation, they changed the age of that character to be that of a girl who was sort of, a fan of Poirot and had read about the previous, crimes he had solved and wanted to participate from that perspective. And Christie was sort of frustrated by that. So she wanted to write a character who needed to be an older woman. And that was how Miss Marple was born. And so it's sort of interesting and fun to think of that sort of genesis, that connection. But Murder of Roger Ackroyd is absolutely fantastic. One of the best. As I noticed, I found an old copy of my grandparents of 5 Miss Marple mysteries. So I'm open to reading any of these. I think I've heard good things about A Caribbean Mystery, but I'm not entirely positive about that. So please let me know. Certainly, there are other writers who come to mind when I think of Christie. It's The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett is sort of a contemporary work. And it's one that gets away from sort of the gritty crime he was writing in works like The Maltese Falcon or certainly Red Harvest, which is an incredibly violent book. And in The Thin Man, we have this sort of, they're in the US, they're not English, but Nick and Nora have this element of being, nouveau riche aristocrats. They're wealthy, they're young, and the way they solve a crime is quite interesting. It feels closer to what Christie was going for with sort of the, moderately well-off, perhaps, English folks in her novels, and I think it works. It's interesting, though, to say a generation later what Dorothy B. Hughes would do with In a Lonely Place, where, again, she has women as agents of detection, women who are involved in trying to catch a criminal and trying to be, you know, really the sharpest people in the mystery. And yet just how much more dangerous this book feels, how more closely this one, I would say, hits home, how modern this book feels just a generation after Christie was writing Murder at the Vicarage. In terms of other works that are set sort of in the English countryside that have that element of trying to sketch in the village, sketch in, you know, several lives, you know, removed from the wilds of society, works like A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr or Loving by Henry Green, which is one of my favorites, feel very close to what Christie was achieving with the way she would sort of fill in the borders of her stories. Certainly a work like Rogue Mail by Geoffrey Household goes in a very different direction, has a similar, I would say, philosophy on some level, but goes in a very different direction, again, a much more dangerous direction here. And then there's a work like Troubles by JG Farrell, which I think is quite interesting. It's set in the Irish independence movement and really shows a unique series of reflections, of course, writing a couple of generations after the events that had occurred, but I think sort of shows that idea of someone out in a new environment in particular. So let me know again, what is your favorite Miss Marple mystery? And I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.